Welcome again. I'm Bill Wiesler. I'm one of your organizers today, and it's my pleasure to introduce this first panel. I have a legal statement to read to you. Any discussion of publicly traded companies is not to be construed as investment advice. So, duly noted. I'm waiting for Domingos, our moderator. Domingos is from the law firm of Saul Ewing, Arnstein, and Lair. Saul Ewing is a really valued partner of Yale's and a leading sponsor of the summit today. We've been working with them for many years, and so many of the startup companies that we spin out of Yale are based on their good work in intellectual property. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Domingos. Thank you for your support and for organizing this panel, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, everybody. Welcome to the panel. Hopefully you're here for breadth and depth versus depth of assets, platform, and value creation. I'm Domingo Silva. I'm a patent attorney with Saul Ewing, and as it has become very clear, I'm not Catherine Doyle. She apologizes for not being here today, but she has a case of bronchitis, so she decided not to share that gift with everybody in the hall. This panel will be basically driven by the experience of the members of the panel, and I want to make this experience as interactive as possible. I invite the members of the panel to share real-life experiences about this dilemma between choosing between depth and breadth of invention. In order to frame this discussion, I'd like to point out that different kinds of sciences developed in labs can either be very broad in scope or very targeted in scope. An example of that, for example, would be a platform which allows for the treatment of different diseases in different contexts. So basically a technology that allows you to target different biological molecules in different parts of the cell. That would be a very broad technology. In the other extreme, you may have targeted technologies. An example would be repurposing of a drug to treat a specific disease. That would be a fairly targeted or narrow technology. And of course, investors will feel differently about the opportunities and challenges of these two extremes. And most of the time, you have an intermediate case where you may have a platform technology, but it's rather narrow, or you may have targeted technology that actually can be broader in the context of treating different diseases. With this introduction, I would ask the members of the panel to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about what they do on a day-to-day basis.
I'm Geeta Vemore with Agent Capital. Agent Capital is a venture capital fund backed by a corporate strategic and also family office of some of the corporate executives and other investors. We started fairly recently, and we actually are investing on the strategy that we had adopted while we ran Baxter and Baxalta's venture group very successfully. So.
Great. I'm Kuldeep Niyote. I'm in the Emerging Technologies and Innovation Group at Eli Lilly. In fact, I just started there about 4 weeks ago. And my role is really to lead external innovation with a geographic focus on the East Coast. And specifically, we put into place a strategic interest in new ventures. And when I say new ventures, these are typically very, very early stage ventures that have just transitioned from perhaps discovery in academia or otherwise into a new venture. And we somehow put strategic interest in place, and we can have a longer discussion what that means, and enable that venture to mature and gain value, and at the right time pursue partnering or collaborative discussions with the new venture.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ben Date from RA Capital. We're in Boston, and we invest sort of across the the liquidity spectrum of biotech, all the way from starting new companies and buying and selling public companies and any place in between. And my role within the firm is to really focus in on those early opportunities. So, what are the interesting key proof of concept experiments that we can build this company around, or sort of how can we aim this pipeline? And so I'm pretty excited about the topic today, and excited to be here with so many innovators today.
Hi, I'm Stacy Seltzer. I'm a partner at Aceling Capital. Aceling is a life science-focused investment firm based in Manhattan. We invest mainly in biopharma, also a bit in the device space. We invest more uniquely both in the public and the private space, looking at mainly clinical stage biopharma, where you get a lot of companies that are very similar, but some tend to stay private and some tend to go public. So we go across both areas.
Hello, my name is Adam Koppel, and I'm at Bain Capital. And within Bain Capital, I work at the Bain Capital Life Sciences Fund, which is a dedicated growth equity, private equity fund focused on the value inflection point of life sciences companies.
I'm Steve Knight. I'm at F Prime Capital, and the easiest way to think about it is Fidelity's venture capital firm. We invest worldwide in healthcare, mostly on the early stage, but up through some of the later stages.
Great. So I'd like to start this discussion by asking the panel how they go about evaluating technology in a lab or a company in terms of weighing out the benefits and the challenges of breadth versus depth. Maybe we can start with Stacy. When you look at a company, when you're trying to determine whether you want to invest in a company, does this paradox of breadth versus depth play a role, or how do you go about it, mitigating any kind of challenges that you may have?
Sure. So we tend to invest a bit later in the spectrum, more Series B, Series C. So we see a lot of companies kind of in both senses of single asset companies as well as multiple assets, and then all the way over to the platform stage. We've evolved over time. I think when we first started as a fund 20 years ago, we were very single asset focused. And then in funds 2 and 3, we weighed heavily towards more platform. And now in the end of fund 3 and fund 4, we've really started to do a combination of both. And I think both strategies can be successful. I think what we look at very much is the management team and how they can manage either really problem solving around a single asset and not letting the downside of a binary event really only determine the outcome of a company, or thinking about ways of mitigating that risk. And then on the multiple asset side, can they find multiple assets that are interesting? When we value a company, we tend to value a company based on the first asset, but then also trying to think, can this management team really take these other assets and create some upside for them? So we've been successful in the single asset play. We've had companies like Durata, which developed dalbavancin. It was a single asset company from day one, where we were in a syndicate of 5 venture capital groups that put in roughly $100 million all the way through its IPO and then ultimate acquisition by Actavis. That one worked. I can think of many others that haven't, like a company named Cytos and allergic asthma. There we did some financial structuring in the beginning, where even though the asset didn't work, we basically got back our money, and as an investment it worked out. But we had every conviction that the asset was going to work and that it was going to have positive phase 2b data based on the phase 2a data that we reviewed. And the trial had a huge placebo effect, and the trial didn't work. And so, we see both sides of it.
Okay. I think we look at it a little differently. We also invest in single assets, also in platform companies. I think we come from what the goal of our strategic partner might be. We have been corporate investor for a long time. So we invested in a company a while back, which was supposed to be technically replacing or disrupting entire franchise of a corporation. It was a $2 billion product. It was a product which was manufactured by extracting plasma from people and extracting the product from it. As you can see, the infrastructure that's required for collecting the blood and extracting the component of the blood was going to be very expensive. And so this recombinant company that was making a product that would actually essentially replace this with a single molecule could have disrupted the entire franchise. So we invested in that company. Fast forward today, the product is so far progressing well. We don't know if it's going to get approved in the end or not. And the company was acquired recently for multi-billion dollar by a corporation called Alexion, which was here at one point, as you know, in Connecticut. So we'll just have to see whether that product will hit the market or not. But if it hits the market, certainly it has the potential to disrupt a huge franchise. So that's on the single product side. On the platform side, we actually look at companies that actually can generate multiple products for our corporate partner. So this is the way we look at the two different things, yeah.
Go to your.
Sure, absolutely. So I guess I'm the only one sitting on the panel who is not in a venture group. So what I will not do certainly is talk about anything that's in a portfolio like my panelist here. But what I can do is really give an example of companies that you must all be aware of that have gone through this process where they start off as a platform company. And then I've had the pleasure of following them over many years to see, how they've turned out, what's their fate, how have they acquired value. And let me first start off by saying I think the balance between pursuing a platform and investing into that platform, both from a resource perspective, from a capital perspective, and maturing the platform to the point where it has the potential to deliver assets, which ultimately are, the outcome that is going to give growth and give value to the venture is very important. What you want to do is you want to have that perfect balance. You don't want to spend too much time and resources on the platform and not be in a situation 4, 5, 6 years into the venture of not creating that asset that's going to give you the value. On the other hand, I think, Stacy, you made the point, you don't want to be focused on one asset, which exposes you to risk. You have no idea how that one asset, as it goes through preclinical development, clinical development, is going to come up against challenges that you just cannot get over, or the biology is going to come and kick you in the back and say, hey, this is the wrong target to pursue. So that balance is very important, okay? And then let me give an example of a company, Nimbus, which some of you might be aware is a computational-based drug discovery group that has gone into partnership with Schrödinger, which is a very heavy-duty sort of a computational machine, developed software to identify small molecules and use in silico methods to optimize it. So Nimbus was formed in 2009, and it's very interesting to see that for almost 5, if not 6 years, they focused on putting resources and capital on developing their platform. And the consequence of that was that they had several assets in their pipeline. And they had a very unique model where they then spun out an asset which was mature into a subsidiary. And they did their first deal, for example, with Pfizer. And over that course of period, they were financed with a Series A, where they got $24 million, and followed by a Series B, where they got $43 million. And the end result of those 5, 6 years was that they managed to do 3 or 4 deals in succession, one with Genentech, one with Gilead, one with a couple with Celgene. And the consequence of all that was that the amount of equity that they acquired, once they started making the deals with those big pharma, was amazing. It was up in the, if I recall, up in the $800 million range, whereas the amount of investment that they had put in that first 5 to 6 years was as I said, around $75 million. So they, I believe, had the perfect balance. Right? They spent enough time, enough resources, enough capital to build a platform And at the right time, they started spinning out assets that had acquired the value that allowed them to partner and in return get capital to keep growing the company.
So in terms of companies that have this platform technology, it seems like at some point they have to convert this platform into an actual product. So Adam, what are your thoughts about the timing for that? How much work do they have to put into validating the platform, and when do they actually have to develop a product? And what should this product be? Should it be, a blockbuster, or should it be more of a concept showing that a product within this platform actually is commercially viable?
Yeah, no, well, obviously, this concept of platform versus specific product, I think, is a really critical one. And I'm a reforming public market investor that's kind of moved backward into the growth equity stage. So I'll give you two major ways that we think about it at our fund. The first is about how value is created, or at least the perspective from a public market investor of how they determine valuation. And the second is the timing, like you said, of the time value of money and how much capital needs to be put in to see a result. So first on this, how does the public market view valuation? And it's two very simple things. It's future free cash flow, and it's the multiple someone's willing to pay for that future free cash flow. So we answer the question as to whether it's a platform or a product by saying it's got to be both. If you just have a product and no platform behind it, then the investor can evaluate it and come up with what's the future free cash flow, simply discount it in a DCF, and that's the value of the company. And it's really challenging to get a multiple on that value. If you're simply a platform with no specific product, then you can get a high multiple because everyone's excited that you have the potential to create lots of things. But if there's no tangible future free cash flow, there's nothing to multiply that multiple against. So that's problematic. So again, we think of it like a T, where you have the platform at the top and kind of a couple specific projects coming down. And you need to multiply the two together to get real valuation. And I certainly think that's how the public market views it. The second component really directly addresses the question you asked, which is how long do people have and what is the timing to get to specificity? And I think that's also critical. We ask ourselves, a couple basic questions before we'll engage and even consider an investment. And the first question we will ask is, can we define the time, capital, and risk required to hit a value inflection point? The time, the capital, and the risk. If you are just a platform company, I think it's challenging for the investor to look at that and be able to define the amount of capital it will take to hit a true tangible value inflection point, the time it will take to do that, and exactly what is being de-risked. Once you then create, though, a tangible product or a tangible program, doesn't necessarily need to be a product, off of that platform, you can better define how much capital will be required, how much time it will take, and what the actual de-risking event is that is creating the value. So I think those are kind of the two ways we think about it. So I think the answer to this question is really, you kind of need to be both.
Yeah, I think if I could expand on that too. When we hear this question, and we spent a lot of time talking about this at our executive session recently, it really is a balance of the two. We want, we're investors, we want both. We want that great sort of killer application, the asset that we can value. And I think RA also coming from the public markets originally, we have this feeling that the public markets really do a lot of your value is determined by that first asset and how much they think that you can get credit for that. But my team focuses a lot on really early investors. As imagine a lot of you out there are at that stage where you just want to get your thing done, like prove that this thing works, right? And then maybe think about expanding into making it into a pipeline. And I understand that, but there's actually some folly in that if you can really zero in on that first proof of concept, and it's a way that you can build value. If you can make that a valuable asset rather than saying, this is our first asset, but these other things we can do now are going to be worth a lot more. So we spend a lot of time kind of thinking, how can we prove in this first experiment, if it's preclinical or this first clinical trial readout, that will get you sort of maximum value for that first asset while proving your platform, sort of the best of both worlds. And that's the kind of balance that we look at when we're trying to help sort of gauge either build a platform out of an asset-focused company or really figure out how you can leverage a platform to build that value quickly. Of course, paying attention to those three things that Adam was mentioning, which is what the time is and the capital and the risk that's being taken off as you do that.
I have a question for Stephen. Of course, we're holding this conference here at Yale that's full of researchers with great science behind them. I think a major barrier is how scientists talk to investors and how they can make their science be more attractive from an investor's standpoint. So in your opinion, if a scientist came to you to present their research, what's the most attractive way in which they can discuss this breadth versus depth aspect? I mean, how should they characterize their research, and should they emphasize the immediate products they can put on the market, or should they emphasize the platform and long-term potential, or how should they weigh these two?
Well, truthfully. So, I mean that I didn't mean to be so glib about that. I think that part of it is, and maybe we think about platform and products just a little bit differently, and we'll see what happens. So with products, you need capital efficiency, and the data has to demonstrate. So if there's something that you are going after, a specific drug, or and often it is a specific drug. We occasionally invest in devices. The data actually drives whether you want to invest. And since we had our roots in what was then called orphan diseases, in the beginning we worried a lot about what Adam was talking about. More recently, and we actually threw all of that out. And if we're curing patients, then we believed in it, and then we pursued it. So I think with things that were either an asset or a collection of assets, that data is really important, and whether it is addressing a major medical need. I mean, when I was in medical school here 30 years ago, one of the reasons that I was depressed was there weren't a lot of diseases, except ironically, as we were talking about infectious disease and surgery and maybe hypertension. There weren't a lot of things that you were actually curing. The great thing about, I think that what is so exciting about now, and why I think the 21st century is, medicine is to the 21st century as physics was to the 20th century, is that we are really curing people. So when it's an asset, if it's a huge unmet medical need, and we are curing or making a significant dent in morbidity, then we're interested in it. This is somewhat faith-based. We believe that somehow the system will figure out how to pay for it. So far that's worked. Pricing is a big overhang. With platforms, and it's part of knowing what you are. So if you're not a platform, don't try to sell the platform. A platform, we think about in two different ways. It used to be along the lines of Nimbus, i.e. there's some sort of either new way of looking at drug development, or there's some significant IP. So, like when we invested when we were starting up Beam Therapeutics, the idea was, okay, this is gene editing 2.0. This is a new base editing, is a new way to do it. We wanted to make sure we had all the IP in that area, and that was kind of the platform. Nimbus previously described as it was a different approach, which is this is a new way to use quantitative, a model from Schrödinger to develop new drugs. There's another kind of platform that I think is right now, I think Annie said it pretty well. This is where bubbles are good, because you can do these things. There are other times, and before 2012, these really weren't so possible, which I would say are aspirational platforms. So, and we've started a number of these companies, like Denali. So neurodegeneration, this is SpaceX meets biotech. Get the best team, pick a big problem, raise a lot of money, because you want to have a lot of money, and go to it. And I think that is not a platform in the traditional sense. And again, I think there the diligence is almost, you want the team, you want the problem, and you want to make sure that it is a tractable problem, but trying to figure out cash flows and NPVs becomes really difficult. And obviously there are things in between, so that's maybe the way we look at it.
So I think in the context of this discussion, it's worth bringing up another example, and I'd love to actually hear what the panel has to say about that. You look at a company like Moderna, right? Now, here's a platform-based company focused on using RNA as a therapeutic. And as you can imagine, lots of application, various therapeutic modalities, vaccines, expressing proteins in vivo, et cetera. I mean, you look at this company funded by Flagship. Founders were very luminary scientists from MIT. Over years, it has come to the point where without having one real asset, right? All right, not really having a sort of a clinical candidate or a potential therapeutic that really gives it some value, it has generated through an IPO over $600 million, right? And if you look at all what they've disclosed, they have almost 21 RNA-based therapeutics in development, right? And if you look at the market cap, I think it's like 7.5 million. And some people, some analysts even say that that's undervalued, right? I look at examples like that in the context of our discussion, and I question, right? Is that
I don't
too
think
heavily?
you're alone.
Is it too heavily, focused on just developing a platform, creating a hype around the platform? But I'd love to hear what other panelists think about that, versus kind of that right balance.
The only thing that's kind of what I meant about truth. So in the end, and this is where things can go very wrong, even and maybe how whether it's a bubble or not. I believe that there has been a secular change that has happened as well. But if there are a couple notable failures that seem like frauds,
sure.
That's going to be a very bad thing. And so I think that being realistic, that doesn't mean that you have to throw aspirations out the window, but I think that raising money at unrealistic valuations with nothing to show for it could end, the tale could end very badly that way. So I completely agree with that.
I think in Moderna's example, they were able to maintain very high valuations and a lot of buzz for a long time because they were a private company.
Yep.
And they've more recently gone public and had to kind of open the curtains and show what exactly they're developing, or show some of what they're developing. And I think now there's a bit of more of a clock on their ability to maintain this valuation, because the public investors will demand more information and hold them much more accountable than the private buzz will.
Yeah, I agree 100% with that, Stacey. And we've seen other companies too, where it starts off as sort of a grand science platform without a really good focus. A lot of the CRISPR companies at the beginning, right? There's a lot of academic hype. I remember the story coming out, what a great tool it was for me in the lab, but I didn't quite see solving delivery and how it was going to be a drug, but they're still able to sort of increase that value point based on the promise of it before they maybe zeroed in on the killer app. And Moderna's one also, where similarly, there was a lot of exuberance in the private rounds, and then once it went public, the perceptions around the leads as vaccines, but they've also now sort of opened up their R&D curtain a little bit, and there's these other really exciting things like in vivo reprogramming, or which we, as a scientist, we know that's the potential for mRNA, but you've got to generate the data to prove that it's actually a drug.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I'd like to build on something, Stephen, you were saying, and I think others have alluded to it, which is when you're capitalizing a company with a great idea, and you want the big ideas, you want to really try to, like the Denali, I think, is a great example. Really a great company with a great management team trying to solve important problems. How much do you want to capitalize, and what valuation do you want to achieve early on? And it is, it's always a dogma. If you're a management team and you're early investors, the board, it's like, let's raise as much money as we can and let's get as high a valuation as we can. But it can sometimes backfire. And I think there are going to be examples, and I've talked to management teams that kind of regret the fact that they have grown so fast on a promise without really having the time to incubate to kind of prove what they're doing. Because, as you were just saying, at some point, the public market, and eventually these things become public because there's only so much that a private market can fund, If you're overcapitalized at too high a valuation, and you're not given the time to really create the value, and drug and medical device development takes a long time. The cycles are much longer than in technology. You're going to lose the confidence of the new investor, and it's going to be really hard for you to continue to raise that capital. And I'm reminded of a line that I was told when I was in France once, in Burgundy, and they were talking about what makes a great wine. And they actually said, it's the stressful conditions, it's the stressful soil, and it's the stressful weather that actually creates the great wine. And that's how you know what year vintage is going to be perfect. And they say, stress the vine to make great wine. And I think there's something to be said for that also in biopharmaceuticals. If you overcapitalize a company and just enable a management team to just have unlimited resources, and they can kind of do whatever they want with it, they're not going to be ultra focused on getting specific projects done. And then they're going to come to the end of their balance sheet, and they're going to have to go back out to raise more capital. And if they don't have something specific to show for the capital that they just spent, they're going to have a really hard time, both for their existing investors and for the next set of investors. And so whereas I really agree with you, this bubble is important to make major changes and allow kind of new breakthrough technology, I think we have to be careful by bringing in too much capital at one time and not really enabling management teams to kind of percolate a little bit under the radar when there's not so much capital there, prove their technology, and then move forward with the larger capitalization.
I agree. The question is often, what's too much? And I also, the other thing I absolutely agree with is being overly, especially early stage investors, being overly greedy about valuations can have a deleterious effect on companies because there is pressure to overpromise, and under-delivering will be how there'll be some sad stories written. I agree with that.
And I think a little bit of the phenomenon is coming from the tech side. What we're seeing is some of the tech investors are actually coming in and investing in these early stage companies in Series A that, I don't know how far that wave is going to be there and stay, but the bubble that was created on the tech side is literally creeping into the biotech side. And I feel like fundamentally they're two different industries. They can hold on to those valuations and create value because it's more of a different sort of applications of those products. Whereas in our case, it's such a regulated industry and a very capitated environment as far as the payers go, that equation really doesn't hold. So I feel like it is true to have, you need to have enough capital initially to start a company for sure, but there is a point of almost no returns if you do not do it the right way. Yeah.
And in terms of the platform technology, there are people who apply the platform to generate NCEs, new chemical entities, which are distinct from anything that's out there. Other people use the technology to basically take, for example, drugs that are on the market that are approved and modify them and make them better by whatever standards you're using. Is there a preference in the group for choosing one company over the other? I guess the first class of companies that have NCEs have definitely very free IP space, for example, and potentially you could be targeting new therapeutic markets with a new drug, but at the same time you have to go through the whole approval process. Whereas the second group, you're basically building up on drugs that exist in the market, except you already have all those results from those drugs and you're just adding to it. Is there a preference in terms of investment?
Are you talking about repurposing drugs?
More like modify existing drugs.
Yeah.
So we've made all of those investments, right? We've made strict single asset repurposing programs. We've seen programs with a technology that could, allow, I'm thinking of Ascendis, where you can sort of pegylate and take a peptide or a hormone and extend it and come up with a best-in-class drug there. It just depends on sort of what sort of data you have, what stage they're at, how de-risked, and how sort of how big of a problem you've solved with your repurposing, if that's what you're doing.
Yeah, I'd say we're similar. The fundamental thing that we think about, actually, I think, Stephen, you addressing your first comment is we want to work with companies that are trying to solve really important medical issues and go for the companies that are solving unmet medical need. And so we kind of think of the end. And if it's a repurposed drug to really address a huge unmet medical need, or whether it's brand new innovation to address that unmet medical need, we want to support those companies. And the reason for that is both because you want to help the patients in most need, but also because if you're really addressing a problem with an unmet medical need, then the pricing reimbursement debate really won't be as big as it could be if it's not that important for unmet medical needs. So I think that's more what we think about, is what is the end market? Because you could have really interesting early innovation, but if it's not relevant to actually create an application for a family or a patient in need, then it's really not worth investing in.
Yeah, so we invested in a company called Palvella, which actually is taking an existing approved product. For some of the scientists you'll know here, it's called rapamycin, that actually is used for immune rejection protection. And the scientists found that this molecule actually has really very good application for an orphan disease where you apply the drug topically and not systemically, because initially the drug was developed systemically in the same patients, and it shows some systemic toxicity. So the formulation was changed to a topical application, and it really is doing quite well, and they're going into phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials. So it's completely repurposing existing product for a very novel, different indication. Yeah.
I wonder if the audience has any questions at this point. I'm not sure if there's a microphone. There are microphones. Somebody has a question?
Question for...
Oh, I think...
Microphone?
You go next.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Speak loudly. Question for Stephen and Kuldeep in particular. Stephen, because with capital comes with early, it tends to be a little more patient, and Kuldeep because of the fact that you represent the big pharma side. In the light of recent setbacks with Alzheimer's drugs, how and what are you looking at for things like, say, mild cognitive impairment and things of that nature?
We're looking for new approaches and mechanisms that make sense. I mean, so in terms of, you do end up balancing your portfolio. So in many ways, for neurodegenerative diseases, Denali was a big effort for a long time. I think that one thing that we're looking at right now is microglia. And in general, the effect of inflammation as a new approach.
Yeah, we also do this quickly. We also started a new company very similar to Denali. We spun out assets out of Pfizer and created a new co called Cerevel with a particular focus in this area. And our initial thoughts were we're going to do everything we can to prevent neurodegenerative disease that's not beta amyloid antibodies, because clearly I think we've well proven that that's not going to work. And I think this neuroinflammation is really a key, and that's going to be a focus for our new company as well. I think that's a big area.
Yeah, I agree that activation of microglia and mechanisms that are involved in that are very good. If you will, sort of the new generation of mechanisms you want to target in neurodegenerative diseases. But I also want to point out that there is interest actually to leverage gene therapy. For diseases like Parkinson's, where you can replace dopamine, for example, where you might have a much more durable response with gene therapy. And again, to go back to our previous conversation, when I look at gene therapy as a modality, here's an example. As some will argue that the space is already saturated, that there are a lot of players and there's a lot going on over there. But I think this is an example where you balance development of a technology that is robust, that allows you to do what it takes to go through the regulatory process, to have a reasonable scale-up CMC commercialization, if you will, insight down the road that is going to make you successful, that's going to actually generate that value from that one or two assets that's going to come out from, I'll call it a platform that one could establish. And maybe it's too late in that space, but that's just an example of, what would be of interest. Not to take away from your question, but I think it's important to think about that balance again.
I have a question there.
What are your thoughts on working with foundations, co-investors, to be able to move programs that they funded in academia into the commercial space and down the development path, so they can really become products?
I think it's proven to be incredibly valuable. I mean, I think the best tangible example that can come to mind for me, but there's many, is Vertex and cystic fibrosis that I think relied heavily on the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation in the early steps when it was Aurora back in San Diego in the early 2000s. But I think it's the foundations that know about the major unmet medical needs and know the issues of the patients and the families best. So I think having them involved is incredibly helpful.
And the other thing I'll add is, in a related area, patient advocacy groups have been extraordinarily helpful in getting drugs through clinical trials and getting them approved. They help with patient recruitment. They help raise money. They help with the regulators, convincing the regulators to, especially in rare and ultra-orphan diseases, reduce the hurdle to get approved. But they play a major role in our ecosystem that I think goes unnoticed to the larger market.
And in earlier stage, to build on what you were just saying, in the early, because you mentioned from getting it to the academic lab into the I don't want to call it commercial setting, but development setting, which takes more capital. I think at least our investment group, we do rely on the foundation. So we think if they're deep in it and know all the players, and if they're willing to support a particular technology, like that's part of our diligence process, and that's really constructive if we know that a foundation that's completely dedicated. You're seeing this in Duchenne muscular dystrophy as well now, just like you did in cystic fibrosis. So I think we rely on as investors, we rely on their opinion and where their capital goes a lot.
We do, and if you're trying to put together something, say get an asset out of pharma, right, that has shown some sort of promise but has been put on the shelf, we've had great success with using foundations and advocacy groups to sort of make the case that, look, this is a real unmet need, and these are the people, and this is something that we would like to try and form into a company, and maybe we can move it along, give it more priority than it would be, if it's not getting a lot of attention in the pipeline in a bigger company. So that's another way that they were really valuable to us.
Are there other questions?
Hi, could you let me know what issue, challenge, or trend keeps you up at night?
Valuations in this market.
Macro.
Yeah.
Macro
I'd
issues.
also say, and they could be linked, I think that pricing is a real issue. So it's an issue if people can't pay for drugs. And so there's lots of reasons why things are not the way they should be. And there's plenty of blame to go around. And I think you can categorize different players in different ways. There's a difference between really bad players and then, today, I think there'll be a new gene therapy for a terrible disease that could cost $2 million. So there's a big difference between those two. But it also is true, and as a group that's invested a lot in orphan diseases, if you add them all up, those are big numbers. And so how to work that out, and at the same time, I certainly believe, you need a return on investment. Someone was mentioning at least infectious disease and maybe specifically antibiotics. That is where things are broken right now. I personally, would rather more money going into inventing new drugs than new flat screen TVs or, an app for my teenagers to find the best party. So those don't seem like things that I would like capital allocated to. But that's a big problem, I think. It's not easily solved.
Yeah.
I think Sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry, for us sitting in big pharma, it's become clear now that we rely on biotechs, right? And everything that has been happening over the last 5-10 years, where entrepreneurs are taking a high risk, and some of those risks obviously are panning out, and then we're the receiving end. My fear is that, and there's been a huge amount of capital investment that's been put to driving that, and some would argue that there is, it's too much, right? And I'm afraid that there might be some bad investments that are made when there's a lot of capital. Investors seem to want to put money perhaps in places where someone sitting in big pharma might say is completely unrealistic or doesn't make sense. And we just hope that it doesn't flip, where capital becomes limited, and sometimes those really crazy ideas that should be funded, that have the potential to have a breakthrough product, might not happen. So that's what really sort of keeps me awake at night.
Well, unfortunately, I think we're coming to the end of the session. I don't want to extend it too much into the next session. So before we leave, I'd like to ask our panel to say basically what they think the hot platform or targeted therapies are right now. Just, you don't need to elaborate for a long time. Just what makes you exciting? What makes it exciting in your area right now?
I still think immuno-oncology has not completely solved the issues of curing or making cancer almost chronic. And so anything in oncology, including the CAR T therapies and all the other gene therapy approaches, are something that I'm excited about. Yeah.
I think it's synthetic biology and leveraging synthetic biology under various therapeutic modalities. It can be incorporated into gene therapy. It can be incorporated into manufacturing, and oncolytic viruses for immunotherapy, et cetera. But I think that general area is very, very sort of, in some ways, naive, ready to sort of take off.
I think we're sort of excited still about gene therapies, about cytokines, and about TCRs and T-cell engagers. I think it's really going to be some breakthroughs there that allow to sort of realize more promise of IO.
So at Easling, we're a big proponent of precision medicine. We've had great success in oncology, and recently I've seen a number of companies really trying to apply precision medicine to big diseases and really break them down. And I think that's going to have a lot of success going forward.
Yeah, I agree with the things that have been said really around gene therapy and others, but I more broadly would say it's the new technologies or the new modalities that enable delivery and localization, because there's so many great genes and that we can go after now that we couldn't do with small molecules or just antibodies, but it's this new generation of delivery technologies that's enabling us to attack diseases that we weren't able to attack before.
I'll just add one more, and it's I would say the democratizing of cell therapy. So making it so that you can pull it off the shelf and at a reasonable price treat all patients instead of the very few. So that's more of a manufacturing, but it is a technical issue as well.
Exactly. So I'd like to thank everybody on the panel. I'd like to thank the audience, and thank everybody.
Really good. Hey, I'm interested in the idea